Welcome everyone, this is Michelle Schumann. I'm the Artistic Director of the Austin Chamber Music Center, and I'm so happy to be here with Maureen Cross. Maureen is the Director of Operations, and she does marketing for ACMC. She also goes by the name Mo. And I brought Maureen in today to talk to you about Love Triangle, our upcoming concert, because Maureen always gives me these great questions for us to kind of talk about, to kind of flesh out what these programs are about. And I know that Maureen really comes from a perspective that is very similar to many of you audience members. You were telling me about this a little bit earlier.
Right, well, I'm not a professional musician in any shape, way, or form, but I did play flute and piccolo through high school and into college, but I'm not a learned musician, so I often come to Michelle with a lot of questions about the concerts, about the pieces, about the composers, just trying to get a better grasp on what these mean, how she's programming these pieces, so I can hopefully try to communicate that better to our audiences and for myself as well. So when looking at Love Triangle, I definitely started to do a little bit of research on my own and just sort of understand a little bit about the composers and a little bit about the story. And then, I started talking to Michelle, and I was really intrigued by this one, especially because it was a pretty saucy little tale of love and love denied, and that was just really, really interesting. And so I was really curious about why this particular story between Clara Schumann and Robert Schumann and Brahms, why was this love story or non-love story in some ways so important to classical music or chamber music in general?
Well, I think in many ways we're so attracted to individual artists and so attracted to composers and how brilliant they are. And I know that those individual composers, they always have a really special story that we can kind of dig into. So to me, it's like this kind of just this triumvirate that happens when three of these great composers kind of get together and they're spending time together and they're sort of passionate about each other and their music is kind of influencing each other and they're learning from each other and they all respect each other so much. So it's almost as if we get this sort of explosion of creativity when we look at these relationships. And Johannes and Robert and Clara, they spent tons of time together. And so they really did influence each other and their music, and really it was all part of this kind of romantic era and this romantic time of exploring poetry and nature and just this sort of I guess the triumphs of the human spirit. And so they were all deeply entrenched in that. So I think it's just amazing that they were such incredible friends, but they also loved each other in such a deep way. And so I think that that's what's kind of interesting in looking at it. And then also, I think the center point of this love triangle, obviously, is Clara Schumann.
Right.
And such in our period of time, a woman like Clara Schumann, one would admire her. But in that time, she was singular. She was, such a powerful musician and pianist, and she was basically the breadwinner for her family. So right there, that's a very unusual thing for the 19th century. When Robert died, she became a single mom at a time when there wouldn't be a single mom. She had 8 kids. So at that time, the thing to do would have been to get married, right, and to have someone take care of her. And the person to marry probably could have been Johannes Brahms, but they didn't. So she was able to have the strength to have a full-on career at a time when women didn't have full-on careers, especially in music, and take care of her family and have all these means of doing that. So I just think that and the fact that these two men were attracted to that, probably at a time when most men would be like, that woman's, she's too much to handle.
I found that to be a really interesting facet of her particular character, and in just reading her story. Because I agree, I think even in today's time, a woman who has 8 children and suddenly finds herself widowed to have a career and try to raise her children, that's a pretty high standard for a woman of today's time to live up to, much less a woman of Clara's time. Yeah. So I found that to be pretty remarkable, and for her to have her concert career, and then I was really blown away to then when her and Brahms could have been together, then they weren't. It was sort of like, whoa, what happened? And so to know, to try to understand how she was influencing her husband and Brahms, and then them on her music, like that's where I was really, you know, looking to you, just like, you know, I'm just really like curious how they're influencing each other.
Even the relationship between Clara and Robert, it was basically a forbidden relationship because Clara's father wanted her to have nothing to do with Robert Schumann. He was quite a bit older than her. I think he was at least 10 years. I should know this. But he was at least 10 years older than her. And when he first met Clara, I think she was 14 years old. So he was already in his 20s. And then when she got a little bit older and Robert was taking an interest in her, and she, of course, had a huge interest in Robert Schumann because he was such a wonderful, incredible artist already. So she admired him in a way. And she wanted to be with him and he wanted to be with her. But Clara Wieck, her father, was like, no way, this is not going to happen. And so they had to keep in touch sort of secretively, and then when she was finally of an age to do whatever she wanted, she certainly did do whatever she wanted to do and got together with Robert in that way. But even when they were younger together, she composed more early works when she was younger. And what's kind of interesting about her as a composer is that she doesn't have a very big body of work. And there was even a quote from her as saying that in her youth, she was naive enough to believe that she as a woman had something to offer to music and to compositions. But then as she got older, she realized that women just do not have this power. So it's really sad in a way. And yet she did write a few works that are really kind of spectacular. And she was influenced by Robert Schumann and his works. What you'll find in the music that we are playing on that weekend is that Clara Schumann's Piano Trio, which is one of her really great works, it very much sounds like Schumann in many ways. And so obviously she was influenced by him. To me it sounds like Schumann, but it's even more lyrical and more sort of expansive in that really beautifully, I hate to say this, but in that beautifully feminine way. But they both have lots of shared characteristics, that they're very passionate in their music. There are lots of contrasts between character and what the music is trying to portray. So I really believe that her trio stands up to a lot of these really great trios. And you'll find again in this concert that that this work, even though it's less known, and she's certainly less known as a composer, really stands on par with them.
So that actually brings me to kind of my next question. I was kind of curious, like, of all the pieces that they all composed during their careers, why these three in particular for this particular program?
What I wanted to do was, at first I thought it would be great to choose three works that they wrote when at the time when they first met each other. But then when I thought, in looking at it, I wanted to choose works that were really indicative of them as people and of their compositional styles. And of course with the Clara Schumann, there's not a whole lot to choose from in her oeuvre because it's just, she didn't write that much. So I knew of this piano trio and I love it. I know everyone's going to love it too. So that was kind of the center point. And it's interesting because she wrote this trio that we're going to hear, the G minor, 1 year before Robert Schumann wrote the piano trio that we're going to hear of his. So they were writing them right at around the same time. And Robert Schumann, he had kind of a year of chamber music where he wrote nothing but chamber music. He had this habit of like really focusing on one genre. So there was a year of songs, and so he just wrote for voice and piano, and there was a year of symphonies where he just kind of focused on that. I think that that's part of his sort of mania and like the sort of obsession with like, I'm doing this now, so I must do this. So to me it's interesting that Clara Schumann wrote her piano trio right around the same time that he was entrenched in writing chamber music as well. And the third piano trio, which we're going to do of Robert Schumann's, is I thought it was just the epitome of him as a composer. His music is so indicative of having lots and lots of contrast between really lyrical and beautiful music and then some like really hard-hitting and kind of different styles of music. And I always like to say that Schumann, you can always tell it's Schumann because there's always sections that are just kind of weird. And I think that that's a really great thing. So we have the passionate and the lyrical Schumann, but then we also have these really sort of strange spots where you just don't know where it's going in the music, and that's really part of not only Schumann's music, but Schumann as a person, the sort of unexpectedness that comes from maybe people who are a little bit mentally unstable, shall we say. But again, so much passion in really both of their works. And then the Brahms piece that we're choosing is from later on in life, and that kind of ties in together too, because even though he and Clara didn't pursue a relationship after Robert Schumann died, and then they knew each other for another 30 years before they...
So they continued their mutual admiration of each other.
Absolutely, and they kept in contact through letters and the rest, and they did see each other at a time, but they didn't, they just didn't make that sort of next step happen. But this piece by Brahms, it's huge it's huge in its nature, but not necessarily in its scope, because it's actually not a very long piece for Brahms. It's just a little bit over 20 minutes, and for a 4-movement work, that's actually a very short thing. So later on in life, he was learning how to take really big ideas and kind of compress them to be heard in a shorter period of time, rather than other composers at the time who might have been doing like hour-long sort of spectacle kind of works. He really had a way of taking the material and compressing it so that you got the most kind of value for your emotional impact. And the piece starts out almost symphonic, orchestral in nature. So it's really big, it's larger than life. And to me, that's the Brahms, the character that I know, is that just this big, strong sort of man. And I think that that's what he also kind of gave to Clara in a way, especially when he was friends together with Clara and Robert, who was quite frail and unstable. I think Clara Schumann saw in Brahms as sort of like stability, strength, and a friend that she could lean on in kind of difficult times.
Where she couldn't with her husband.
Right. She was, I think, in many ways a caretaker of her husband, but she loved and admired him so much that it certainly wasn't out of pity in any way.
Right. Mm-hmm. So now their compositions, a lot of times, they definitely reflected their feelings for each other. So
one of the ways in which they did it, and it's just kind of fascinating, is that they would almost compose in kind of anagrams in a way. So there was a motive for Clara that had took the letters of her name and made a musical line out of it. And both Brahms and Schumann.
Cool. That's really cool. That's cool.
So both Brahms and Schumann used that in their works, and then they had other ways of kind of having these little sort of secret messages to each other through music.
Because I see that as like kind of, when I think about like modern music, I think, modern music, we're very accustomed to this idea of emoting a lot with modern music. Modern music being written, I mean, even when you're thinking about like pop or whatever, of being, love songs of being written with an emotion and, or breaking up songs or whatever. Right. But but at the same time, I think sometimes when I think, and again, based on what little textbook knowledge I know I have of classical music, I think a lot of times of composers being commissioned to write works. And so they're commissioned to write a symphony, commissioned to write a piece, but not necessarily writing pieces from the heart, out of emotion, and here are composers who they were here, they were writing these code love letters in their pieces. And I see that as a very modern thing, so I think that's really, really interesting.
Well, and I think it all stems from our art form, which is chamber music, because these composers were getting commissions, especially for symphonies and for operas and for kind of bigger things oftentimes. But a lot of times, chamber music was exactly that. It was like the time when the composers could just write for themselves or write for their friends. And for instance, the Brahms trio that we're going to be hearing, there's a little chronicle of it saying, chronicling the first performance of it, which was done in a home with Brahms at the piano, his friends on the violin and cello, and Clara Schumann was turning pages.
Oh,
so it's just sort of kind of, it's
so cool.
It is really amazing to think about that. And when we listen to this music, whether it's at home on Friday night or whether it's at the Unitarian Church on Saturday, which is also a pretty small environment, it's really trying to get close to those roots. And I think that's the thing that I love about chamber music so much, is that it almost always is from the heart and has these sort of secret messages, and that's the kind of stories that we like to share. And so glad that we could talk about this right here for you now, and can't wait to see you guys at the concert coming up.
Yeah, absolutely.
It'll be great. So thank you both for being with me, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.